We're absolutely in for a treat today with this extraordinary woman, Mollie Hughes. Oh my goodness me. I expect it to be like that music hall programme of blessed memory where you go, woo, when I mention some of her extraordinary achievements. So we are in the company of a truly inspiring young woman. She is Mollie Hughes. She's a sports adventurer and explorer who in 2017 broke the world record by becoming the youngest woman to climb both sides of Mount Everest. Come on. Excuse me? And this is the one that really gets me. I mean, I can almost imagine doing that. Yeah, I right. Then, in 2020, she became the youngest woman in the world to ski solo to the South Pole from the coast of Antarctica. It's madness, basically, isn't it? It is. But now the great thing is she's sharing her passion for the great outdoors in her really beautiful book, Blue Scotland, the ultimate guide to exploring Scotland's wild waters. So please, a huge Cove and Kilcreggan Book Festival welcome for the amazing Mollie Hughes. I think you should look the book up and show it to people in case they haven't seen the book. Have a wee look. There's a lovely thing. There you go. So we're going to be dipping into that for you. And you'll be signing some copies later on. So clearly with you, Mollie, I've just highlighted a couple of your extraordinary world-beating achievements, but I think we should reassure people of the nature of the book. It's absolutely not about extreme sport for people at the peak of physical perfection, is it?
Absolutely. So my first book, which is amazing, maybe one of my first book festivals that I've been. It got published at the end of September. Great to be here.
A perfect setting, isn't it?
It's lovely, especially with that out the window. It's amazing.
I know.
So my book, Blue Scotland, was a lockdown project, a lockdown idea. I think when lockdown came and we were kind of confined to our houses, and I live in Edinburgh, so I wasn't allowed outside of Edinburgh. At the time, I was living in a small little one-bedroom flat, and I just got back from Antarctica, so I'm used to being a big, open horizons all around me, but when you're confined to something small, I think I longed for this, and I longed for what was actually basically on my doorstep, which is Scotland and the incredible blue spaces that we have here, from the coastline, the amazing coastline, the islands to the west and the north, the rivers, the amazing sea lochs and freshwater lochs, so much of it that I wanted to explore. And we did it, myself and my friend Rachel, who's a photographer. She just lives up the road in Arica, and she's an amazing photographer. The book is written by me, so it's got some mediocre writing, but the photos are amazing, really, really beautiful. And we kayaked, and we paddleboarded, and we swam, and we surfed on so many different locations around Scotland. Oh,
yeah, it's absolutely stunning, and some unexpected ones too. And in the opening pages of the book, Mollie, you tell us that you grew up very far from here and from Scotland, as far away as you can get on mainland Britain, the south coast of Devon, another beautiful place, but the sea on your doorstep. And then when you were 13, though, I think the family moved to a house close to the beach, so I wondered about that. Because, I mean, we all love the water, and there's something very elemental, even if you're not actually in the water, but you're just going for a walk along the beach with the dog or whatever. Just the bracing nature of it, the sea breezes. I mean, was that important to you? Did that sort of change things? Did it become almost like part of your DNA?
Definitely. I think when you grow up close to the ocean or any body of water, you become very connected to it, and even if you live there for a long time. And I grew up in this small place called Torbay, famous for Torquay, the English Riviera, very different to the wild coast of Scotland. Lots of arcades and piers and holidaymakers, but it is beautiful. But when I was 13, my parents split up, and with my mum, we moved to this little house that luckily overlooked the sea, as most houses do in Torbay, because it's a big hill behind the ocean. And every morning, you'd open the blinds, and the ocean's just there. And with its kind of changing mood, so you'd know what was happening, it faced east, so the sun would come up. You see the sunrise, which was incredible. And I think that connection to the ocean definitely became more kind of entrenched when I was around 13. It was about the time I started surfing as well.
It's such an interesting age, that, isn't it? Because the world is opening up to you. And things can make a big emotional impact on you too. So it sounds like a combination of the two for you.
Absolutely. And I think it probably wasn't until later in life that I realised just how important blue spaces are. And maybe not actually until I started thinking about this book, because there's this concept of blue health, which is like an emerging topic of study. And there's a lot more research going into it these days to say that blue spaces are even more beneficial to us than even green spaces for our well-being, for our mental health, And it's true, and I felt like I've always needed it. If times of stress in my life, if times of upheaval, I'm always drawn to a blue space, usually the coast, and it does have this amazing kind of calming effect on you. And I think that's maybe part of the lockdown thing as well.
Yeah.
I felt like I needed to be out there in these blue spaces. I couldn't at the time, but made up for it with the book as soon as we were allowed to travel again.
And was your mum very encouraging of you, embracing the outdoors?
Yeah. So both of my parents are very outdoorsy. My dad he retired maybe late 50s and became a sea kayak instructor. So he's very connected to that. My mum is a big rower, so just rowing, lots of sailing out in Torbay. So they're very in line with the ocean as well.
So I presume you always felt at home in the water then?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it changes where you are, and Scotland's a very different ballgame to Devon. It's much wilder. You've much more to think about when you're in different places in Scotland, but that connection of still being on the water.
And it's the thing about being focused in the moment with all of your intrepid adventures I want to come on to a wee bit later on. And so you were just 21 when you joined that expedition to climb Mount Everest. And I was thinking, what a contrast to your maritime passion, but you had in fact been climbing mountains for a few years, pretty young, hadn't you, before that?
Yeah, so growing up in Devon, as far from the mountains as you can probably get in the UK. But when I was 17, my school organised this expedition. It was like a charity expedition to go to East Africa, do some charity work, and then have a chance to climb Mount Kenya. And it was just a really kind of interesting thing for my school to do. I went to like a big, rough, comprehensive school in Devon, so it wasn't something that my school had done before. And it was something where you had to raise all the funds for it. So you had to go bagpacking in supermarkets, you had to go to car boot sales and sell all the rubbish from your bedroom and make up as much money as you could. And we kind of raised the money over a couple of years. Went off to East Africa, did a bit of charity work, and then had the chance to climb Mount Kenya, which is just a stunning mountain. 4 or 5 days of walking uphill, a bit of high altitude. We got to like just below 5,000 meters, and that was my first kind of real experience of mountaineering, and I guess of achieving something as well. By the time I got there, I wasn't feeling too exhausted. I was just loving it. Like the clouds would open up, you could see the savannah hundreds of meters down beneath me, and coming from this small town in Devon, suddenly being in East Africa, suddenly being on this beautiful mountain, it definitely just, I think, set the course for what I did after that.
Do you think there is just something in you, and maybe that comes from your family, it's just embracing the notion of adventure, relishing that?
Yeah, maybe adventure, maybe just wanting to be in the natural world a little bit, no matter what environment it is, if it's the ocean, if it's the mountains, if it's the polar regions. Maybe just want to see the whole world and how incredible it is.
Yeah. I was interested to find out that Mollie had studied the psychology of Everest climbers for your final year dissertation project. I was thinking, whoa, if you studied that, I imagine there are lots of ups down. It might have put you right off climbing Everest. But I mean, clearly you were immersed in that. So tell us about that and what kind of impact that did have on you.
So I was at uni in Bristol and I was studying sports psychology. And for my last kind of project, 10,000 word essay, I'm reasonably dyslexic, so at the time, sitting down to write, I've written a book now, it doesn't really count, but at the time, sitting down to write a 10,000 word essay scared me more than anything. So I thought it has to be something I'm super interested in for me to commit to this.
Yeah.
I had this love of mountaineering. I thought, what's one of the biggest kind of challenges in mountaineering? And obviously Everest springs to mind. It's the most famous mountain in the world. It's the highest mountain in the world. So I found 7 guys, I could only find male climbers at the time, around the UK, and I went and visited them. I went to London and met one of them. I went to the Lake District and sat down with them and interviewed them and learned about the challenges they faced, their motivation for being there, the psychological pressure that sits on your shoulders as a climber at base camp looking up at that huge mountain. And it was probably halfway through the first chat with this guy, Scott, in London, that I was pretty hooked. And I knew I didn't want to just sit there and write about it for the next few months. I wanted to start my own journey of trying to get there.
Wow. And this is what I've tried to make clear at the beginning. This isn't a book about extremes, but in terms of what you've done, in the book you described that. So the Everest trip, a year of agonising training and sponsorship raising. It's like the combination of the two, the training and you've got to raise the money. Followed by a 9-day trek into base camp, followed by 6 weeks acclimatising on the mountain. Now that doesn't sound like fun. How did you stay motivated? Or were you just kind of in the moment? You knew this is what you wanted to do?
I think when the ball starts rolling on that, it just gets faster and faster and gains momentum. So I guess coming as a 20-year-old at the time, thinking about wanting to be here on Everest in 12 months' time. I had to get super fit, I had to train, I had to increase my mountaineering experience, I had to travel to the Alps and the Himalayas and climb more and more. And I also had to raise the money, which is unbelievably hard, especially when you're a student at university. Everest can cost anywhere between 30 and these days you could probably pay £80,000 if you wanted to. So I often say raising that money was harder than the climb itself, in a way, because it was. The climb was very hard, but the raising the money was hard. So it was a year of just focusing on that. But as I made small gains throughout that year with fitness, with getting one sponsor, two sponsors on board, it just starts to happen. And as you get closer and closer, you finally get to the mountain, and then you're there on the mountain, and there's no going back when you're there because it's taken so much to get to that point, and you feel so lucky and so privileged to be there. Like not many people get to step foot on Everest, let alone have the opportunity to hopefully get to the top.
What did your family think back home? Were they worried for their girl?
Yeah, absolutely, of course. I told my dad first, and I didn't tell my mum for a little while. So my dad knew for maybe a month or so before I told my mum.
Right.
And they always super supportive. They've never said they don't want me to do it, but they've never said they want me to do it, I guess.
Well, that's so interesting to hear about the whole process. It is a process and it's a cumulative.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, of course, you have to continue literally no going back. So Mollie reached the summit in May 2012 alongside your Sherpa guide. This is the thing, you were not alone. Tell us about that person.
So he's called Lakpo Onju, amazing guy. At the time, in 2012, I think he was 25 and he'd already climbed and summited Everest 8 times. He's from a little village in the Khumbu Valley called Pangboche, which is just around 4,000 meters. Amazing guy, super humble, super amazing climber, and definitely helped me get up to the summit for sure.
Yeah, what is the role? Because we hear about the history of particularly of Everest and Sherpa guides. Yeah. He must have played a really important role in terms of support.
They're guides, they're mountain guides. He helped me get up to the top. He was always there. So you're with a much bigger team, but on the final summit day, so that final push above 8,000 meters, you kind of split down in with yourself and your Sherpa guide. So most of that night, it was just me and him. He was always a few feet behind me, just kind of encouraging me on as we went along. We got up to the top about 8 a.m., took some pretty unimaginative photos. We've been climbing in the desert for like 12 hours. But on the way down, that's when we got into a little bit of trouble. And that's, I think, where our relationship was needed and incredibly tested. Because when I was there in 2012, that was the kind of first year where it was quite busy. And I'm sure you guys have seen the pictures recently. And 2012 was that first year where you had that picture on the front page of the Daily Mail with that like queue of climbers going up the Lhotse face. So I've been on the front page of the Daily Mail with 150 other people in this queue. But me and Lakpo, we got up and we summited early before most of the crowds because we could feel how busy it was. But on the way down, coming down the Hillary Step, which is the crux of the summit day, the hardest rock climbing move, it was just a bottleneck. So all these climbers were coming up. We were stuck there for, start off maybe 45 minutes, an hour, and then we pushed down a little bit further, just couldn't get past these climbers, another half an hour. My oxygen ran out at one point. And at that point, Lakpo just managed to stop all these climbers coming up, pulled me down the main part of the Hillary Step, and I'm pretty sure I slid down at my bum. It was a bit hazy, like when you're that hypoxic, it's a bit hazy. Got to the bottom and he pulled out a fresh canister from his rucksack, put it on my mask, and within a few minutes of breathing this fresh oxygen at a high flow rate, I started to feel better again. But if it wasn't for him at that stage, I would have been pretty helpless up there, for sure.
Yeah. God, that's going back to summiting, as you call it. Yeah. What was that moment like?
I'm not as good as people think.
I wondered whether, given all this sort of build-up, whether it's kind of
unfortunately. I think because people there's all sorts of songs about being on top of the world, isn't there? People always think it's this amazing moment, but I guess that's not why you're there, really. And by the time you get there, you've been on the mountain for 8 weeks. You've been in the desert. For us, it was about 12 hours, and you've still got to get down the mountain. And statistically, if you're going to die on Everest, you'll do it on the way down, not the way up, because you've been in the desert for so long, your body's got such a lack of oxygen in it, it's easy to make mistakes on the way down. So that bit at the top is just the point where you turn around. It's just a change of direction, you start coming down, and then the real celebration and happiness comes at base camp when you're finally safe.
Wow. Do you ever get annoyed with people in everyday life who might moan about stuff? And go, I didn't get much sleep last night, and it's this, that, the next day. It's a bit cold. Do you just want to slap them?
No.
You would, wouldn't you?
I definitely moan about everyday stuff as well. Absolutely.
I believe you. And now, just going through the chronology, maybe not surprisingly, you were happy to take a break from mountaineering for a while. And when you were 23, you moved to Scotland. Round of applause! Yes! Woo! And you live in Edinburgh. So what prompted the move to Scotland, apart from the obvious? You know what I mean?
So I did a stint in London after Everest, and I worked in an outdoor shop in Covent Garden. And it was the one, I don't know if anyone's been there, Ellis Brigham with the ice climbing wall. And I used to teach people to ice climb in the basement in the middle of London, which was a bit weird. It was fun.
That's bizarre.
But then after a year or two in London, I was like, I need bigger spaces. And going for runs around Clapham Common didn't really cut it. You have to travel so far to get anywhere. And just this yearning for bigger, wider spaces. And I had a few friends that were up in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and I just made the move up here and never looked back.
Really?
Yeah, as soon as I moved here, I worked in Tyso on Rose Street in Edinburgh for a few years, which was good fun. Made lots of friends, lots of people to go hiking and climbing with. And it just kind of evolved from there.
Yeah, and in the book, I mean, you make it very plain, and I think it's true. And are there members of the Cove and Kilcreggan Sailing Club in today? No? Give us a cheer. Yeah, good. That's good. This is a book for you guys, that's for sure. But you say in the book that Scotland is an adventure playground for water sports enthusiasts. And I do wonder, you're not begging for compliments about Scotland, but I mean, given that you have been around the world, tell us about Scotland. How does it compare to other places?
It's really good, isn't it? It's really good. There's so much to do here. If it's water sports, which this book is all about, if it's blue spaces, if it's the mountains, like mountaineering in Scotland is incredible. Some of the hardest days I've had in the mountains have been on Ben Nevis in the middle of winter in horrific conditions, but amazing conditions, amazing days. It's an absolute mecca for every type of water sport, from the islands, the highlands, the coastline, the lochs. There's nowhere else I would want to be. Sure.
And what a contrast to London, the idea, that's like some kind of metaphor, isn't it? You in that basement with the climbing wall. But you know, the thing about London is it takes you forever to get out of London, to get to anywhere vaguely wild, whereas we're so lucky. Absolutely. Especially the West Coast, Glasgow, you know, you're out and into something fabulous, so really good. And of course, we've got all our fabulous parks as well, all around the country. So, returning to Everest in 2017, you're 26, so you're the youngest woman to summit Everest from both the north and the south sides. I don't know. How different are the two routes?
Pretty different. So the south side, where I was first, is climbing up from Nepal. The north side is climbing up from Tibet. And the border of those two countries is right on the summit, which is quite cool. So the routes don't meet at all until you get to the summit. It's colder, it's windier, it's more technical, so more rock climbing, and you spend more time above 8,000 meters in the death zone, where there's very little oxygen, but it's much quieter, and it's much more remote, and absolutely stunning. And I was 5 years older. I had an amazing team. Lakpa came with us again. My friend John Gupta, who's a mountain guide from Bristol, and then another Nepalese guide, Leela Tamang. So just 4 of us, which meant we could be super nimble. And when the weather was good, we could climb. When the weather wasn't good, we could retreat back to our camps. And we just had a lot of fun on that side of the mountain.
In your early days mountaineering, did you have a natural aptitude for rock climbing? Because I always remember rock climbing, I was terrified. And then suddenly I found my mojo only once, at the Kerrang in Skye. Nice. And my boyfriend then was with me, and he was taking these photographs. I was like, oh my God, I can just do this. I should be able to do it. And the film didn't develop in the camera. I can't believe it. No. We took lots of proper cameras back then. It was like, no, I have no visual evidence. I really did. But as I say, I only did it once. Yeah. So it was really strange though that that gave me a little insight into a sort of psychological, just suddenly it clicked.
Yeah. Rock climbing's super interesting, and I did a little bit of it in Devon. There's amazing sea cliffs to climb on Dartmoor, the Tors. In Bristol is a bit of a mecca for rock climbing, and then coming to Scotland, more and more here in Scotland. I do enjoy it, but I don't love it as much as I love mountaineering. Being in the wide open landscapes as opposed to just looking up at a rock face. But it's part of it. It is part of mountaineering. Yeah,
absolutely. And so talk about Everest, and you talked about that bottleneck. I'd forgotten about that and those images actually. And thank goodness for your man to guide you. But we also know how many people have died attempting to reach the summit. I think at least 300, might be more. So can you give us an insight into that? Because it must be that mix of the physical challenges and endurance, but also mental endurance as well.
Yeah, for sure.
How you build up to be able to do that.
I think I often say that with all the trips I've done, especially with Antarctica as well, it's 75, 80% mental compared to the physical side of it. It's basically all in your head, and it's about being as resilient as you can be. Everest is a little bit trickier because there are some objective dangers. There's things that are unstable and can fall down on you. There's a few kind of avalanche spots. On the north side, well, both sides have a fair amount of deaths each season. I think when I was on the south side, I think maybe 12 people died that season, and on the north side, maybe 10. But maybe 250 climbers summited at a time as well. So I don't know what those odds are, but
yeah.
And on the south side, it's not, well, it is. There were a few I experienced on the south side, but on the north side, you feel it more kind of aptly because a lot of the bodies are still left there. On the south side, it's quite easy. It's not easy, it's hard, but easier to bring the bodies down if somebody dies. But on the north side, because it's more technical, because it's steeper rock, if somebody dies above, say, the second step, it's almost impossible to bring somebody's body down. And dangerous for the 8, 10 people you need to do that. So a lot of them are left. So I think I saw 5 on that summit night on the north side, which is pretty harrowing.
Yes,
sure.
to say the least.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, when I was thinking about talking to Mollie, I was maybe some of you follow on Twitter a guy called Nick Ray, who's quite extraordinary. A few people nodding there, and he is uses the A Life Afloat on Twitter, and. What's amazing about him, he's brilliant at filming, so he's got little cameras mounted, so you just feel as if you're in the kayak with him. I don't quite know how he does it, but it's absolutely stunning. And he's been very open about having depression, about having various mental health problems. He's really reached the lows as well as the highs. But it's clear from the fact that it's like he's taking us in the kayak with him, and clearly that's part of a huge part of his mental resilience. So he's on a 12-month solo sea kayak expedition, and I think it was yesterday, we just feel that we're travelling with him. So yesterday, I loved this, he said with the wind behind him, he was moving at 6 kilometres per hour without paddling. Just loved that, but it gave you an idea of the winds. And I think there's no doubt for him that kind of combination of the physical, but also the physical endurance and paying attention to everything and being rewarded by seeing dolphins and all the rest of it happening. But it's just that focus is good for him. And I'm so aware of especially a younger generation of people coming through, and given how beleaguered our brilliant NHS is, and there are long waiting lists for mental health, to see somebody for counselling or advice, how much would you say that if people, and maybe particularly young people, can just get out into the outdoors, that they can learn so much physically and emotionally from that experience?
I think it's partly a case of resilience. Resilience is something that we grow. We're not born resilient at all. We're born pretty helpless. But resilience is something that we need to work on and grow. And the outdoors is such a great way to do it. And I think I've said a few times recently that when I was 21 and I managed to get up the south side of Everest, I definitely didn't have the resilience then to spend 58 days alone in Antarctica. I had to go through that Everest trip, I had to go through the north side and all the other expeditions I've done between that to grow that amount of resilience I needed to take on my Antarctica expedition. So it's something that we can grow, absolutely, but it happens when you step out of your comfort zone and you push yourself a little bit, and when you're not comfortable, that's the sweet spot where resilience can grow. And that helps us in every kind of facet of our life, if it's work, if it's family, if it's just our general mental health and well-being. And it's hard, but I think in Scotland, having it here on our doorstep, having this beautiful place and access to this mecca of all sorts of outdoor sports, it is there and it's ready for us. It just needs to be accessed a little bit more.
Yeah, and I suppose it's particularly thinking of younger people, children and teenagers, say, it's presenting it to them as well and making it seem attractive. I mean, I remember the old days of, doing gym at school, and it was like, oh no, got to do gym, and not embracing it. And actually, I was pretty good at it. But there was this kind of, I think maybe particularly for, I don't know if it's still the case, but for girls, there can be a thing of, no, that's not for me as well.
For sure. You've got to get them interested in it and hooked on it. There's amazing organisations that do that. I do a lot of work with Scout Scotland over the last few years, who are incredible, and they do that every day, every week with, I think it's 35,000 young people across Scotland, which is great.
Yeah, and what I love about your book is as I say, it's a very practical guide. So you talked about the photographer. What name check her again?
So Rachel Keenan. She lives up in Arica. You
Oh,
might have seen her out and about with the camera.
It is absolutely beautiful, but it really is like a practical. It's almost like you could just take it in wherever you live, including Glasgow.
Yeah.
So tell us a wee bit about the Clyde.
The Clyde, yeah. So one of the first locations we did in the book was the Clyde in Glasgow city centre. And it was just as we were emerging from lockdown, it must have been like April 21. We were allowed to just travel a little bit, I think. It all got a bit hazy then, but I think we were allowed to travel a little bit. So we went across to Glasgow on a really cold April morning. We pumped up our paddleboards just by the Transport Museum, and there's a little slipway down there onto the Clyde. We got onto the Clyde at about 7 in the morning. The sun was just coming up. There was nobody about. The water would like flow onto the front of your board and freeze, like solid. Like it was that cold, so you didn't want to fall in. I didn't want to fall in the Clyde on a nice summer day, let alone in April. And it was amazing. And we headed up past the BBC building, past the Armadillo, past those awesome bridges, turned around and came back again. Saw a seal, which was beautiful. So I think with the book, I wanted to have accessible places and places close to like huge populations of people, because of the concept of blue health and how important it is for us to get near those places and on them. And in Glasgow, if you work in one of those big buildings for some of those big corporations and you take your lunch break and you go down to the Clyde and just have that moment of relaxation, moment of well-being, and you can do that because it is a beautiful river system.
That's so funny because I work in the BBC building a couple of days a week, Mondays and Tuesdays, doing radio shows. And I always think, it's such a shame that for such... It had been a centre of shipbuilding and ships around the world. It's like, is there anything at the Clyde? It's like, if you see one boat, it's like, wow, you know. And the idea of seeing you guys paddleboarding would be extraordinary.
Amazing.
Because there's pretty much nothing there now. And so give us some top tips actually of other places, because you take us right round Scotland. Are there any other maybe unexpected places that people might not be aware of, particularly our sailing club?
So there's a few city centre, Glasgow, Edinburgh, near Inverness, and then we went off to the Outer Hebrides, which was incredible. We had 2 weeks last summer? Yeah, last summer in the Outer Hebrides, and for some reason in this book, you will notice if you get a copy that every time we got the camera out, it was sunny. I don't know if somebody might sue me for this at one point, that I get it completely wrong, but I swear, every time we were shooting between April and October, the sun was out.
But we do know that. I mean, that's the thing. We always joke about the weather and the rain and everything, but we do also have magnificent summers too.
And when the sun does come out, like,
occasionally,
this place is incredible. Yeah. And in the Outer Hebrides, it was amazing. We had 2 weeks travelling from Barra all the way to the top of Lewis. Incredible, stunning beaches, sea locks, amazing places to explore. And then on one day, it was my birthday, my 31st birthday, we had the chance to go to St Kilda, which was mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing. You've done a bit of stuff. Well,
we did on our podcast network, Big Light Podcast Network, we did a drama based on it, an 8-part series, all about the final days of St Kilda when the people had to move, and even there was a U-boat turning up and stuff like that. So what was lovely was people listened to that all around the world. It helped that we'd an Outlander star in the cast as well, so people were listening. But I remember hearing a couple of older guys saying that they'd listened to the last episode in their car and they couldn't get out of the car until they heard the last bit. But it was that we were also lucky to get field recordings from St Kilda, so we actually had your actual sounds of St Kilda there too. Well, tell me about it, because I'd love to go.
Yeah, you have to. Absolutely have to. You were only there for a day, and we went from Harris on a boat, and on the boat out there we saw minke whales and dolphins and amazing gannets that would just fly next to us. You come into Village Bay, and it's this huge kind of amphitheatre, and the whole of the island just goes super steep from the village. The old village houses are there, the little crofts. You have a few hours on the island to explore, so we went to the highest point we could, looked down the huge sea cliffs, which are the highest sea cliffs in the UK, where the people that used to live there would abseil down and collect seabirds with their feet on the ropes tied around their waists. Absolutely incredible. Came back down to Village Bay, and to include it in the book, I had to do some sort of blue space activity. So we went for a quick swim in Village Bay. And then it's the longest chapter in the whole book, so I'm just going on about the bird life and the people that used to live there. And the publishers didn't really want me to put it in, because they're like, are you actually doing any blue activities here? I was like, we went for a swim and we got some pictures of that. So it's in the book. But it's more of a chapter, a celebration of of this incredible island and its history, I guess.
I had not heard of the concept of blue health before.
Yeah, it's definitely new.
Can you expand on that? You guys have heard of blue health much? No, mostly no's?
Awesome. So it's definitely an emerging topic of study, and there's some amazing stuff going on at Exeter University where they're studying it and just finding out how good it is for us. And it's being close to blue spaces, so simply walking along Loch Long, or it's being in them, or it's being on them, which is amazing. And just how good it is. It's very much an emerging topic, but it's...
Because I suppose we hear a lot about, literally tree hugging and going out in forest bathing. That's the one I've heard quite a bit about, which is just basically going out in a forest. 'Cause I kept thinking, is there water involved there? No, there isn't. But and again, I think post-pandemic, although there's still... COVID's still around. We have to be more careful. All of that you were talking about, this is a COVID project. I've spoken to so many people, whether they're writers, musicians or whatever, and extraordinary work came out of that period of enforced confinement, actually. Yeah. But the idea of getting back together is important. But just to get out in terms of, I think, the after effects, some people have long COVID, but just generally of a feeling of mental oppression. Yeah. It would seem to me that this is more important than ever right now to try to, especially, I think people of all ages, but I think especially younger people that I do feel very sorry for because their school careers and college and everything, so much has been disrupted for them.
And there's a lot of anxiety and there's a lot of pressure and a lot of fear on young people at the moment with everything that's going on, from the climate crisis to coming out of COVID. But yeah, I think getting outside into big open spaces is amazing for us. And the book really ties in two different water sports. But actually, I think it's a great guide just to the blue spaces of Scotland. And if you don't want to go and jump in a kayak, you can simply walk along that stretch of coastline and still get almost the same benefits. Yeah. I think there's nothing beats immersing yourself in that blue space, but being close to it, being near it, you still get those well-being benefits.
I'm just wondering how fit. I was at pains to say you don't have to be super fit, like you are clearly, but you have to be like anything, seek doctor's advice before trying. I don't mean that, but jumping into on a paddleboard or kayaking, presumably you should do a wee bit of
for sure. So we've rated the book in terms of the experience you need for each location and the kind of adventure level of if it's you need a bit more experience to go off and travel around this headland, or if you just going off to a small little calm bay. So it's all rated. And I emphasise a lot the need to get professional training, to get paddleboarding lessons, to get kayaking lessons, to learn how to surf so you can navigate these places as safely as possible.
And I suppose that the elements that you're talking about that are, free, if you like, are also important given the current economic situation and cost of living and all of that. That's another thing I think. It's the idea of going, whether it's walking or climbing a hill or swimming or whatever, it's free.
Absolutely.
So that would seem to be a major...
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I really wanted to have swimming in the book as well, because a sea kayak, like the one on the front cover, costs you hundreds and hundreds of pounds.
Right.
And you need the training, you need the experience, but there's so many places where you can just go for a swim around Scotland and still get those benefits of the blue space. Anybody
here do wild swimming, as they call it? Oh, yes. Wow. This morning. Good on you, Haya. Wow. Where did you do it?
Just down there.
Just down there. And what was it like? Bloody freezing, obviously.
No. Oh, amazing.
You lit a fire and had a lovely time.
Incredible.
Anybody else do any wild swimming this morning? Yeah? Where did you do it? Oh, with you. So it was a big, fabulous group of people. But that's brilliant. And I've got a friend who lives in Orkney, and she and her partner, I love the fact they live in a place called Ladysmith, and it's just wonderful. They've got this brilliant house, and she has found the joys of wild swimming, and they take little films of them all plunging into it. And she would never have done anything like that when she was working at the BBC back in Glasgow. Yeah. Oh, so it's been utterly transformative.
My mum has recently too, down in Devon, so it's a little bit warmer, but she's been going out. She did this thing for Surfers Against Sewage, this great charity. In October, you had to do a dip a day. So for the whole of October, she went swimming every single day, got her little hat, a little swimming hat on it, and she's just absolutely hooked. And it's so good for people. She says it's like a drug, like going into the water, and you feel the tingling and the addiction of it.
I have to try it. Maybe not today, but soon. Not today,
give it a few months.
And so we talked about Glasgow, the Hebrides. I mean, it's always that thing, isn't it, asking people to choose a favourite, but do you have any particular favourite parts of Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, all of it really is amazing. The book's got 65 locations in it. I guess I travelled to a few of them before. When we started the book, I hadn't been to the far north coast, which was really cool. We went up the east side of it, through Thurso, which is an incredible surfing destination. And as you travel along the north coast, it's kind of farmlandy, the northeast, and then suddenly the mountains of the west start to open up in front of you, and some incredible beaches along there, places to swim, to kayak, to surf. So that was amazing. And then down the far northwest coast, down to places like Ukmelvik, and you see Sullivan on the horizon. It's
well, that's the, I think nothing would make you feel a little bit fear at all. That solo skiing thing, I still can't get my head around that. I really can't. I mean, how long did that take?
So I was out there alone for 58 days.
58 days on your own?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I do find that absolutely remarkable. I mean, that is real resilience. Because you are literally, I've got it right, you are on your own. But also, clearly it's very physical. But what are you when you think back to that, what feelings does it evoke if I make you think about it now, which you maybe don't usually think about?
No, I feel happy with that one. I feel proud of that one. So it was 2019 and 2020 because I went over New Year. And I think with Everest, I was 29 at the time. So I spent kind of most of my 20s focused on Everest and big mountaineering expeditions. But then Antarctica was somewhere I'd always wanted to go and just be and just like absorb the vast frozenness of it. But it took a lot to get there. I had to choose what kind of thing I wanted to do down there. And I decided I wanted to ski solo from the edge to the center of it, to the South Pole. I had to raise all the money, which was harder than any of the other. It was much more money. I had to train for it. I had to learn to cross-country ski. And then I was there on the 13th of November, 2019, and I got dropped off by this little plane and these two Canadian pilots, and they flew off into the distance, and suddenly I was alone in Antarctica with 700 miles.
A sharp intake of breath, just as you say that. I am.
And 700 miles from that point at Hercules Inlet to the South Pole. I think it's 1,100 kilometers. Is there like a disappointingly small pole? It's like this high, and it's coloured like a barbershop. Yeah, it's got like a globe on top, but it's like this high. It's like really weirdly small.
The wee pole. But seriously though, because sharp intake of breath, the audience is empathising as well. It's like, how the hell? And I suppose it's the idea of being solo. That's scary. Yeah. If something goes wrong.
It was much. I think I feel more proud of this trip than anything else, maybe because it was solo. Yeah. And all the other trips, there was always somebody to defer to. Lakpa was there, John was there. There was always somebody to make decisions with, to make the final decision. It was on them. It was never on me. There was people to support you, people to give you a hug, people to have a laugh and a joke with. Yes. I think as British people, we find it very comforting to, when you're in a really crappy situation, to make a joke out of it, and it makes it so much better. But when you're alone in Antarctica, I didn't have that.
I'm going to tell myself a joke. I've gone mad.
Exactly. And it was hard. I literally don't think I laughed for the first 30 days or something, because there's nothing to laugh about when you're on your own. So I wanted to do it by myself to try and, prove to myself that I could make all these decisions by myself and I could support myself through and survive in that kind of environment. And I mean, I did. It started badly because when we landed, the pilots flew off. The first 2 hours, the sun was out, it was beautiful. But after the first 2 hours, I kind of hit the first hill, and that's the point where you hit the landmass of the continent. And from there to the South Pole, it's like 700 miles, but it's all uphill because the South Pole is at 2,800.
I'm imagining you're skiing down.
Yeah. A lot of people think that.
I know.
Because you're going south.
Yes.
But it's all uphill. It's one of those gradual hills for 58 days, one of the really hard ones. And as I hit it, this big storm started to come. And it was a weather front that moved in, and it basically meant that in those first 8.5 days, I had horrific conditions with winds up to gusting about 60 knots. I had a whiteout, so when the visibility's to here, I had a whiteout for 8 days straight. So every morning I'd open the tent, couldn't see anything, just complete whiteout, and I'd have to ski through it into the headwind. With that strong winds, the temperatures at the lowest got down to about minus 45, or one day the lowest. So the first 8 days were absolute hell of my big plan and expedition to go down and see Antarctica, and I couldn't see anything for the first 8 days.
I'm speechless, actually. Just at the thought of that. I think it's probably all of our idea of hell. And can you tell us, how did you sustain yourself psychologically through that?
It was really hard. In those first 8 days, it was hard, because you got there and the storm had come so quickly that you hadn't got into your routine yet. You hadn't got into the rhythm of the expedition, which takes time.
Would you have cried if your tears hadn't turned to ice?
So I didn't cry until the sun came out. And when the sun came out, it was the most magical moment, probably one of the most magical moments of my life. And I could basically see this line in front of me, and for like an hour I was skiing towards it, and I was like, what is that line? And I realised as my vision started to clear and the clouds started to clear that it was the horizon. So the first time I'd seen the horizon for a few weeks, I saw these 3 mountains to my right-hand side, the 3 Sales Mountains that I'd been navigating towards for the last 8 days. So actually seeing them and knowing I was in the right place was great. And then that's when I cried.
Wow. Sorry to make you relive it.
No, it's fine.
She's getting misty-eyed now remembering it. But I also think what's really brilliant about you is you're a woman. And I think that young women need as many bloody positive role models as possible in a slightly beleaguered world. I think for women, it continues to be, both here and abroad. Our status is sort of diminutized daily, I think. And I think seeing strong women is really, really important. I mean, maybe you presumably you don't go around thinking, I'm a role model. But you must be aware of that the impact that just by setting an example, just that ripple effect is important.
I mean, I absolutely hope so. I spend a lot of time going to schools, a lot of time with the Scouts, Scout Scotland. So I really hope so. And I guess I didn't, because it happened to me, I guess that's how I realised it. So when I was first on the journey and I was thinking about Everest, I'd interviewed those 7 guys for my dissertation, and I wanted to do it. And I always say that was the kind of catalyst, but actually I didn't believe I could do it until I read this story about a girl called Benita Norris, who was like 22 and she'd done it a few years before. And when I read her story and that she was young and she was like similar to me, when I read that I was like, okay, I can do it. Yeah. And as soon as I read that was the turning moment.
That's so important, isn't it? To have an example. It's like, it's possible.
For sure. And it's a shame that I couldn't it didn't give it to me talking to those guys, but as soon as I saw this woman doing it, that was the real, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other, anything else you've got your sights on that you want to achieve in terms of those sort of world firsts or not?
Not at the moment, no. I think I got back from Antarctica at the end of January 2020, so we had a few months of freedom into lockdown, and then everything changes perspective when I guess I couldn't think about going abroad. And for a few years after that, you can't really think about big scale expeditions, raising the funds in that kind of climate, travel. So that's when I turned my focus a little bit more to Scotland, started on this book project. Yeah. I also now run an ethical adventure company in East Lothian in Dunbar. So we take people on journeys into the mountains and into the ocean, paddleboarding, surfing, coast-steering. So yeah, I feel quite much more grounded here. It's funny how things work out, isn't it? You'd have expected the pandemic, but out came the book and other things, and maybe a different sense of perspective on life too. Yeah. I mean, I'll never say never to another trip. But
I'm not surprised.
At the moment, there's nothing in my head
at the moment. Not surprised. Well, look, thank you so much. I'm going to ask if any of our lovely audience have got any questions for you. And right away, lady in the front row, go on yourself.
Thank you very much for that. That was
a pleasure.
Inspiring. And, congratulations on everything you've done and everything you will do in the future. And thank you to you, Janice, as well. And you've a voice that's been in my life for years, and it's magnificent. It's actually weird to hear your voice coming out of a person in front of me. Yeah. So thanks for that. I had the same one with Ruth, by the way, Ruth Wisher.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I'm being restricted, obviously, to one question, so I've got one burning one. I lived in the northeast of Scotland for years, and it's very often forgotten about as being a place that's actually well worth going to. And I was going to ask you if you'd done anything. I've not read your book, so apologies for that, but have you done anything up there? For example, there's an amazing little village in Aberdeenshire called Crivey, which was destroyed in 1953 by an extremely bad storm. Okay. And everybody deserted the village, all their boats were destroyed, everything. Yeah. And you can walk to that little village round a coastal ledge, round a cliff from Gameray, which is properly called Gardenston, but known as Gameray.
Yeah.
And Crivey is known as Crivey, but it looks like Crovey. This is typical of Aberdeenshire. I'm wondering if you know about that and if you've been there.
I don't know about that, but I wish I did. That could go into...
Maybe you can go sometime.
Second edition.
Blue Scotland too. But yes, we spent a lot of time up there, and I'm actually going to get the book out so I can see all the ones from Stonehaven, Aberdeen. We went round to Sandend Bay, which was incredible.
That's called Sinai.
Sinai. Okay. Yeah. Oh, amazing. And it's beautiful. And we went paddleboarding, and then that night we saw the Northern Lights. We were camping in the campsite in the front, and it opened up. It's incredible. And then we kept on going up all the way to the North Coast, Dunnet, Thurso. Thurso is incredible. It's a world-class surf break off Thurso East. It's incredible. Then along the North Coast. So yeah, we spent a good few weeks up in the Northeast.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing a trip with Mollie. That's brilliant.
Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. I've got another question.
I'm a very old paddler, been paddling in Scotland all my years, but you are still an inspiration.
Oh,
so a young inspiration, and I hope you bring lots of younger people into the sport. But I've got another question. So when you were out on the South Pole, what is it you do with your self-talk to survive, like 8 days going into 60-knot winds? Really curious about that. But keep going, and Scotland is world class.
Love it. Good question. And I think through those 8 days through that storm, because it was so soon and I wasn't in the rhythm, that was just all survival mode. And I tried to be careful, like with my time. I think the only way I got through the whole thing was to be really regimented, like super regimented. In a normal life, I'm not regimented, but I had to be down there. So I would wake up at the same time. I would, like at 6 a.m., I would boil snow for an hour and a half, eat much fuel as I could, put my tent out, down, pack up the sled, and be on my skis by 8. Ski for an hour and a half, stop for a 10-minute break, ski for an hour and a half, stop for a 10-minute break. And I'd do that for 10 or 11 hours each day. And be in my tent every night at 8 p.m. so I could call the logistics guys and tell them my location for the day. Every single day, so be super regimented. But at the beginning of the whiteout, because it was so soon and because I was just there, I hadn't got into the swing of it. So that was a lot of survival and a lot of worry. So I think when off the back of the whiteout, I felt quite down for a good few days. And after that, I came into the concept of self-talk when I really needed it, and the idea of positive affirmations, which is not something I would do normally when I'm looking in the mirror. I wish I could, but it's basically the idea of saying a positive phrase out loud about yourself to improve your state of mind. And I'd seen a TED talk about it before I went, and I basically came up with 3 phrases that I would say out loud to Antarctica. And I whispered them at first because I felt embarrassed even though there was no one around, weirdly. And then I had to shout them. And one of them was really rude, and I don't know if I should say it in front of this audience.
I think you should go for it.
I'm not sure.
It's Scotland.
So the first one wasn't rude. That was just to say, I am strong. And that felt important because I never felt as weak as I did. Like, I had a 100-kilo sled. I was pulling uphill after the storm. I felt so weak. So I say, I am strong. The next one was to say, I am inspiring people. And that felt important because it was too hard just to be about me and my own achievement. And the third one was the really rude one. Come on. And it's not how I was feeling, but it's how I wanted to feel. I would basically say, I am a fucking badass.
Yes!
As loud as I could. And the more I shouted that, the more I felt like one.
And that's not that rude, is it? I was expecting something much worse. Absolutely incredible. Well, you've absolutely inspired me. At least I'll go out for a brisk walk home. Yeah. I'll do something like that. Any further questions? Yeah, hello. Question at the back.
Hi, I was just wondering if you'd written anything or had pictures of your expeditions to Everest and for Antarctica, because I would love to read them.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, so loads on my website. So my website is molliehughes.co.uk, and there's blogs from all of the trips there, loads of photos. If you find me on YouTube, I don't know what my handle is, but there's lots of videos and stuff on there, and there's more of my websites. So tons of stuff on that as well.
And you're Mollie Hughes, Mollie.
Yes.
Hughes, if you're looking for it.
And on my social media, on Instagram and stuff, there's loads of pictures. A book, yeah. I am thinking about it. I think a lot of people are asking. Yeah. Says the people that come to a book festival. Yeah, I should write one about the trips for sure.
While you still remember it.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yep, loads. Let me do... Who was here? Okay. Oh, you go, sorry.
There's one at the back.
How are we doing for mic? So you've got the mic. Sorry, I forgot that small point. Thank you.
Hi Mollie, and thanks very much for that. It was really, really inspiring. I was interested in your description of Everest and an amazing human endeavour, but also, you know, some negative things about, you know, and the queue of people going up there and seeing dead bodies, and I just wondered, was that your most enjoyable mountain, or is there another mountain that you say is the one that you really loved the most?
It's a good question. I think with these big expeditions, the scale of enjoyment and not enjoyment always pushes to the not enjoyment side. But then it's like, why do you do it? Why do you go back? And you're there because of how incredible the place is. Like, climbing on Everest feels like an absolute honour. Like, there's so much history there. It's so unbelievably beautiful, right in the middle of the Himalayas. When you're on that final summit ridge, you look out and the whole of Nepal is on your left-hand side, the whole of Tibet is on your right-hand side, just like mountains as far as you can see. So it's an absolutely incredible place to be. And recently there's so much more negativity with it, especially I think the media has a worse view, or they're trying to push us to have a worse view than actually there is. I never saw the rubbish there that the media reports. I did see the bodies and there was a bit of queuing, but the queuing is kind of linked to small weather windows. So when the weather window, if you're lucky, will be a few days, and you have a few days of light winds, around 20 miles an hour or less if you're lucky to get to the top. But for a lot of the time in recent years, those weather windows haven't been emerging towards the end of May when they usually do. So if there's only 24 hours or something, everyone rushes up there at the same time, which was the problem in 2012. So I think that's where that came from. But going back for the north side definitely made me fall in love with that mountain again, I think.
Brilliant.
I don't think that's really an answer to your question, but...
I think we've got time for another question.
So when you were describing the ascent of the north and the south face, my only reference really is top of the cobbler, where you get the you get the choice of two paths, and if you pass 5 people, people say it's like Sucky Hall Street. But I just wondered, how much do you enjoy the risk? And when you're sitting in your flat in Edinburgh before Antarctica, did you let yourself think, I might not come home?
So risk is a really interesting subject, like really interesting. And I think from the outside, people think a lot of the things that I do have a lot of risk in them. But when you're on these expeditions, everything you do is to counteract risk and to not take risks. And actually, I'm a super risk-adverse person in everything that I do. Like, we'll go hiking, my partner's at the back, and she's always wanting to go and do like the scariest thing. And I'm like, no, come away from the edge. We're not doing that. We're not going that way. So I think it's all about being risk-averse, and I think that's how you stay alive in places like that. So in Antarctica, for example, everything I did was to stay in control of myself within those conditions. So in terms of what I ate from the time I left my tent to how much I skied, from when I refueled myself, when I pitched my tent. There was maybe 1.5 days where I didn't ski because the weather was so bad and the wind was just racking through my camp. And the idea of putting my tent down was terrifying, because if you let go of your tent in that kind of wind, it's going to disappear so quickly. So I took the idea not to put my tent down, spend the day in my tent listening to Harry Potter instead. So I think everything I do is quite risk-averse, and that's how you keep going, I think. I think I could take more risk and probably achieve more things and do more cool stuff, but I kind of prefer being alive.
Yeah, yeah.
I think.
I think we've got time for another question. Yeah, gentleman there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Mollie. That was really intriguing. I recognise both those emotions, the exhilaration when you get to the top, but I also recognise that scream you had. I have to say my scream at the top of mountains was much more rude than yours was, I should say.
What was it?
I'm not telling. I got put out. I was intrigued that you did your dissertation on men and mountains. I'm just wondering what the psychology of that told you. I'm intrigued to see. You don't need to name names, but I'm intrigued.
It was a really interesting project, and it was nothing professional. I was 20 years old, like a third-year uni student. It wasn't very good. But I guess what I found, I interviewed 7 guys in total, and they all have very different psychological experiences, like in their kind of prep for the mountain and on the mountain themselves. Some of them, well, 2 of them were, I think they were Marines, and they had a friend in Afghanistan who died, and it was their friend's ambition to climb Everest, always his. So they were doing it fulfilling his ambition. And that was an amazing motivator for them to keep going in all sorts of stuff. There was one guy who was a childhood ambition. So for his whole life, he'd been focused on Everest, wanting to get there. And that was an amazing motivator, but also a huge amount of pressure because he's self-funded it, raised all the money, been talking about it since he was a child. And then when he gets there, you've got that pressure sitting on you. There's so many things that can go wrong and so many things that are a bit uncontrollable. But the best one was a guy down the Lake District who has a super pragmatic way of thinking about everything, especially mountaineering. And he, I guess, taught me to not ever think about the summit until you're there. You're thinking about getting to Camp 1 and you're celebrating getting to Camp 1. You're celebrating that success. You're coming back to base camp, you're resting. You're then thinking about your next small stage, your next day, your next hour. So bringing everything down to the present, which I think is something that I've just used throughout all of my expeditions, especially Antarctica. Like in Antarctica, you couldn't think about 700 miles away. You couldn't think about the South Pole. At times, you could only think about the next 10 minutes of skiing. So yeah, it was really, really interesting. I'm very glad I decided to do that as a 20-year-old.
Wow. That's even good just in terms of people's general daily life and mental health. Break it down.
Yep.
Don't think about the big overwhelming thing on the horizon. I certainly learned that from my various Everest expeditions. I didn't want to mention them for Mollie. You've been an absolutely brilliant audience. I think Mollie's been absolutely fascinating, and I hope you'll go and are you going to be signing books and doing that kind of stuff upstairs? So let's have a huge round of final applause for Mollie Hughes. Thank you.